The beginning of the night. Do you have her? Nick asked. Spino nodded. She doesn't want her mother to find her. I don't care. Where is she? Nick demanded. Mabel slightly poked her head out from behind Spino's right ankle and said, Dad? Nick was relieved and sighed. Thank God. He was about to explain the new developments to Mabel and Spino when someone ran past on the street that ran alongside the backyard. Nick waved and shouted, Tony! Secure the gate! Put all the guards we have on the wall! Everyone! And keep them out of the trenches! We're on lockdown! Tony, usually the head of the midday watch on the south wall, nodded and kept running down the street. And I want a skeleton crew surrounding the gate at all times! Nick called after him. Tony paused for a moment, turned around, and called, That would break protocol! Nick sighed with mild frustration and then shouted, I know! I wrote the damn protocol! Just do what I say! With a nod, Tony turned away and continued sprinting down the street. Nick turned back to Mabel and Spino once Tony was out of sight and explained everything to them and said that no one would be leaving the community anytime soon. Mabel didn't understand. Trees are talking and shooting darts at people that kill them? Nick shrugged and said, At the moment, your guess is as good as mine. Have you told Mom? Mabel asked. Yes, Nick said, nodding. Now, you two stay in town as far away from the walls as possible. Spino, please keep a close eye on her for me. I'm going to be very busy and need your help. You know I'll do anything for you, Spino said. I know. Thank you, Nick replied before leaving the two and going back into the house. He opened the door, walked in, and closed it behind him. Did you find her? Susan asked Nick as he entered the house. Yes, she was with Spino, Nick replied as he walked back into the kitchen. She didn't go and try to get herself eaten again, did she? Susan asked. There was venom in her voice. Nick sighed. No. And leave them alone. We know where she is, and I don't want to risk her running off again. Promise me you will leave them alone. His voice was firm, and his eyes had a dangerous look in them. His tone of voice made it clear the conversation was finished. Susan gave a reluctant nod. Good. Put Mama Bear back in hibernation for a while. We can have a calm discussion over Spino's reasonable method of keeping our daughter safe when this issue is resolved, Nick said, and left the house through the front door. Mabel sat down against Spino's shoulder, and they shared nervous gazes. Both were unnerved by what Nick said. It sounded completely bizarre and didn't make any sense at all. The post-apocalyptic world was full of weird, strange, and mysterious anomalies, but voices in the trees? People getting shot by deadly darts? What was going on? It was a scenario that sounded bizarre, even in such a strange world. You know, Mabel, I have seen a lot of weird, unexplainable things over the years, Spino eventually commented. But I think this takes the prize for the top spot. Talking trees is even stranger than, well, even stranger than the way the old world was destroyed when your dad was younger. Mabel didn't reply. She remained leaning against his side in silence. Eventually, she spoke. Why does my mom think you're bad? I feel the safest when I'm with you. Spino sighed. You know, what I think it comes down to is what I said before. You guys see the world differently than I do. What I see is a reasonable option. Clearly wasn't in the eyes of a certain mother. Well, I don't care what she thinks about you, Mabel replied. I feel safer sitting out here with you, Spino, than I would inside that house without you. Tony climbed onto the wall's walkway for guards and stood next to the main gate. His brother, Ben, stood next to him, and they scanned the road as far as they could see. Empty. Stayed empty for a long time, until they saw movement. Something crossed the road, nearly too far away to be seen. Tony squinted and chuckled. It was his favorite dinosaur as a kid. Nothing to worry about. That's just a Styracosaurus. Lucky bugger. I wish we had some of his armor, Tony said. Maybe it would stop the stinging. Forget that. I wish we had some napalm, Ben replied. Burn this whole damn forest to the ground. And then talking trees wouldn't be a problem. Well, that would also take care of the sightline problem. Unfortunately, it would probably burn the community down with it, Tony replied with a light chuckle. So, even if we see some drums of napalm at some abandoned military base one day, I say we leave it alone. Nick spent the next hour gathering all of the off-duty guards for the community, as well as some volunteers, guards in training, people from the community's militia, and anyone else who was young and fit enough for what he had planned. I want volunteers, Nick explained once he had everyone gathered in one place. Tonight, we stand on the wall, facing the forest, shoulder to shoulder, all of us armed. At the first sight of anything unusual, we fire into the trees and don't stop until whatever we see is dead, Nick continued. This isn't a requirement. I'm asking. He finished speaking, and everyone present all volunteered to help protect their home. Everyone who volunteered was provided a weapon from the armory and was given a specific set of tasks to complete before nightfall. A majority of those who volunteered were recruited to help with the next part of Nick's plan. This part of the plan would be carried out throughout that afternoon and evening. Throughout the rest of that day, the people who lived near the walls were moved out of their homes and told to go to the center of town. It was an unpopular but understandably cautious move by Nick. He wanted to make sure everyone who lived close to the wall would be out of range of any darts or anything else that happened to be fired over the wall by the unseen threat during the night. During the evacuation, one little boy cried and asked his mother why they had to leave. Nick saw this and walked over to him. Hey, buddy, he said. This is just a one-night thing. It's just to make sure you're safe. Now, be brave. Show your mom how brave you are. The boy sniffed and whimpered, I'm brave. Nick smiled. Good. You're a future guard for sure. He took notice of the toy in the kid's hand and asked, Metrodon, is that your favorite? The kid nodded. Uh-huh. They have big scary teeth. I want one for a pet. Nick laughed. I tell you what, after this stuff is all over, I'll go into the forest and find a talking one for you. He smiled once more at the kid, then stood up and nodded apologetically to his mother. I know this isn't ideal, but I want everyone to be safe, because we don't know what's out there. No, it's okay. Until we know what's going on, keeping everyone away from the walls is probably best. I'll just think of it as a community-wide sleepover, she replied, her manner assuring but on edge. She took her son off to find a place for their stuff and to lay down their blankets. No! The park will be the most comfortable area, Nick called after her. I told the volunteers to make sure families with children get priority for sleeping there, but it'll fill up fast. You might want to head that way now. Around him, more families were moved from their homes. Children cried or screamed about leaving their homes and toys. Entire families took only necessities, sleeping bags or blankets, pets, water and food, and books or games for entertainment. Some of the older kids met up with their friends and started telling scary stories or played games of tag and hide and seek amongst the crowd. After watching this part of his plan for nearly an hour, Nick walked aside and took a break from it all. He was uncertain about how all this made him feel. As he leaned against the side of a house, he heard heavy footsteps and saw Spino's head peek around the corner of the building. Mabel was with him, napping, and Spino had her cradled in his arms. Are you okay? Spino asked. Not really, Nick sighed. I hate seeing you like this, Spino replied and laid down, wrapping his body around his friend to hide Nick from the others on the street. Nick walked across the small enclosure and rubbed Spino's snout with a slight smile. I'm worried. I'm worried that this will be it. That we'll lose this time, he admitted. This is nothing like the kind of threat the Dino Riders presented, or the kind of threat small random groups of marauders present. Spino snorted and gave Nick a small lick across the side of the head. We won't lose, he said softly but confidently. Nick wiped the saliva off his face and shook his head before his eyes gazed at Mabel. At least she seems peaceful. Thank you for watching her. Every day. Spino nodded. She's been in a good enough mood most of the afternoon, all things considered. She just finally got tired and decided she wanted a nap, but she didn't want to go inside the house. Nick nodded. Again, thank you. You two have such a wonderful connection. It's different than the one we have. It's special. And I'm happy she'll grow up with you at her side. Don't sell yourself short, Nick. You're her father. You'll be there for her as she grows up too. You gave her a home. You sang to her on nights she was scared. You fed her soup when she was sick. Every time you look at her, your eyes light up, and you look 10 years younger. You have that special connection that only a father and a child have. I'm just the cool older brother who likes poking fun at his little sister, Spino said, chuckling. After a few seconds, Nick began to laugh as well. In a seemingly empty clearing deep in the forest, the ambient silence was broken suddenly by voices, but no one speaking could be seen anywhere. The voices seemed to have no source at all, like ghosts talking. It looks like they're preparing for us. Do we do it tonight? Yes. Another voice hissed from a tree. We do it tonight. We end them tonight. They don't see us and won't. They'll all die by the unseen. We've never taken on a big group. They have many weapons. We must remain unseen to win. We mustn't be drawn out. We always remain unseen. And even if they ever saw us, they'd never win. With that, there was the sound of dozens of creatures moving through the forest. However, all the while, the clearing remained completely empty. Some of the guards and volunteers were already on the wall and watching the woods. Others, acting on Nick's orders, tried to find people who might have still been hiding in their homes to avoid having to sleep outside. While that was going on, Nick was trying to spearhead everything and keep the people calm and their movements orderly when he, literally, ran into his wife. Sorry, Nick said, trying to brush past her and keep going once he was sure she hadn't fallen from their sudden impact. Susan turned to follow him and grabbed his shoulder. Nick, can we talk? Not now, Nick replied. I don't have time for a heart-to-heart. I've got to get this place ready for whatever is coming. I need to talk to you, Susan insisted, following him. Nick turned, looked at his wife, and said with some force, What? I want to know something. I want to know if, after this is over, we could maybe try again, she said with some hope. Nick sighed. Put the mama bear to sleep, huh? No, Susan sighed. But I did have an epiphany while watching you organize all this. And what was that? Nick asked. I've been a real bitch since last night, Susan replied. Nick half chuckled. No. You're just acting like an overprotective mother. Mine was the same way. About the only good thing there was about her. You've never mentioned that. Is that why you stayed so calm when I threw you out? It helped. I also knew that more fighting on the issue right then would make things worse, Nick said. He smiled slightly, and he took Susan's hand and said, We don't have to try again. I knew you didn't mean the things you said last night. Susan sighed, wiped some tears from her eyes, and whimpered, I'm so sorry for what I said. I know. And I know you didn't mean any of it. I forgave you last night. Thank you, Susan replied, unable to find the words. Nick gave her a comforting pat on the shoulder, promising that they could have a real heart-to-heart conversation later. He gently kissed her cheek and then turned and walked away. Throughout the community, many people were sharing what they would do when the forest scare was over. Just as it had been during the fight with the Dino Riders, they were looking forward to and talking about the future. It was a great way to increase morale among the shaken masses. One of the guards was a man of Native American descent, and he was saying to everyone that if they survived whatever happened next, he would finally do something that he'd been planning for since the apocalypse began. He would return to his people and his ancestors' land. Others said they just wanted to save their loved ones, or save the community that they built with their bare hands. Still others looked forward to a better future. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a fiery mix of shades of oranges, pinks, and yellows. Susan was watching her daughter, who was laying against Spino's side. She was still sleeping. Susan still didn't understand how Mabel was so content to be near that dinosaur, but this wasn't the time to worry about it. She was worried about Nick, too, and she wondered what was going to happen to the baby. Her worries were stemmed from the fact that they were trapped. They couldn't send a request to the other communities for help because they couldn't enter the woods, which meant they were on their own. Everyone was forced to wait for something that might happen. As the tension settled into the air with near physical force, Nick approached his top scout and pulled him to the side quietly. "Steve, you're my right-hand man. The best one I've got in this whole community," he said. Standing between two houses, out of everyone's sight, Nick leaned in and whispered, "If something happens to me, you're in charge." Steve looked very nervous, but nodded slowly. Nick then added, "I want you and a few others to take inventory. We have to be ready for the worst-case scenario. We'll need an escape plan. If tonight goes bad, if it looks like we can't win, we're going to have to make a dash for the nearest community. So, meet up with the people you think are best for this assignment, but tell them to keep it hush-hush for now. I'm going up onto the wall with the rest of the guards. I want people to be reassured that we've got this." Nick patted Steve's shoulder, turned to leave, crossed the community grounds, and joined the guards at the main gate. He passed his family and nodded to Susan as he moved on. The sun had set by then, and it was nearly dark by the time he climbed onto the wall. Standing to the right side of the gate, he waited for what might come with everyone else. As the night dragged on, the guards on the wall were stonily silent. No one spoke, no one made quips or jabs. They all just watched and listened, waiting. The forest was silent, save for the sounds of insects buzzing in the trees. As hours passed and nothing happened, no one felt any easier. In fact, the tension increased because of the stillness. Suddenly, darts came at them from nowhere. Spino didn't like the silence that had settled over the community once night fell, but he stayed still and didn't move away from his family to investigate the cause. He'd been given some secret orders by Nick. If an attack did come at some point in the night, he was to protect Mabel at any cost and not worry about what might happen to Nick. Spino accepted his mission and hadn't moved from his spot at Mabel's side for hours. He felt the tension increasing in the community as the night dragged on, but he was hopeful that nothing would happen. But then it did, and suddenly, it was as if the world was ending. The man right next to Nick was hit first. Then, dozens of darts flew out of the darkness. Some people jumped off the wall, others ducked, and others were hit. "Fire!" Nick yelled, and everyone who remained on the wall opened fire into the trees. They fired into places the darts seemed to come from, causing leaves to rain down to the forest floor. Gunshots tore through what had been an otherwise silent night. The flashes from the gun barrels added waves of flashing light to the moonless darkness. The man who had been shot first lay on the ground at the base of the wall, screaming and trying to pull the barbed dart out of his chest. "Where are they? I don't see anything," Ben shouted. Nick held a hand up. "Hold your fire! Don't waste the bullets!" The gunshots stopped, but everyone kept their weapons raised and ready to fire. Nick grabbed a walkie-talkie from his belt, raised it to his mouth, and spoke. "We have contact on the gate side wall. Everyone on the other 3 sides, keep alert." He put the radio back into its holder on his belt. "Someone, get some lights over here!" A guard standing 6 people away from Nick shouted over his shoulder. "No! That'll give your location away! Hold your ground for now!" Nick shouted back. "We can't fight an enemy we can't see!" the same guard shouted. At the moment he finished speaking, he was shot in the mouth by another dart. "Oh shit!" Tony said when he saw the guard fall backwards off the wall and land on the ground dead. A few people, mostly the inexperienced volunteers, began firing into random spots in the trees. "Stop firing! Keep your heads on straight! Duck down! Make as small a target as possible!" Nick yelled as he crouched. "Nick, what are we going to do?" "That poor guy was right. We can't fight what we can't see," Ben shouted over to him. "I'm thinking on it. Just stay alive until I come up with something. And for the love of God, don't get hit by those darts," Nick shouted back, his voice loud enough to be heard above the sporadic gunfire still ringing out around him. After a moment, Nick called out, "Hey, anyone's gun have a night scope on it? If it does, maybe we can see what's in the trees." He knew that there were a few in the armory, and he hoped that someone in his vicinity had a weapon with one on it. "Not here! I'll check further down the wall," a voice shouted back. Nick cursed, stayed crouched down, and raised his head enough to peek over the wall. As he did, he saw something bright yellow and flickering amongst the leaves on the trees. It was fire. Before Nick's mind had a chance to register what was happening, the object suddenly moved. Nick realized with horror that something on fire was flying through the air. There was a small moment when he caught a glimpse of the object's silhouette while it was midair, and realized it was a Molotov cocktail. "The hell?" another voice shouted from down the line on Nick's right. The cocktail had been thrown from somewhere within the trees, and it sailed through the air, over the wall, and smashed against one of the other guards standing nearest Nick, who could only watch as it all happened in slow motion. The man screamed as fire erupted across his body, and he tumbled from the wall and onto the ground, as dozens more darts came flying out of the trees. Some hit their targets, and others bounced harmlessly off the wall. The guards who weren't hit in the barrage began jumping to the ground to get out of the line of fire. "Fall back!" Nick yelled. He stumbled as he yelled, and fell to the ground. He groaned when he hit the dirt, and looked up. People were running away from the walls, and the burning man was still screaming and rolling on the grass. Nick knew there was only one way to help when he saw the man's bones were visible in places under the flames, melted clothes, and charred skin. He raised his gun and fired a bullet into the man's head. The burning man went limp, and his head rolled to face Nick, and the movement caused his charred skin to crackle. And despite half the man's face having been burnt off, Nick still recognized the man. It was Donald that he'd been forced to shoot. Nick then stood and looked around. One guard sitting nearby had been hit 3 times and began screaming in fear once he realized. Another man ran up behind the injured guard and shot him in the back of the head to end the coming suffering the darts guaranteed to give those they hit. From the sounds of gunfire, every other group of guards on the walls were also losing against their invisible enemies. As the battle began fizzling out around the community, Nick began leading the survivors between the houses toward the center of the community, where they'd be out of range of the darts. "Okay," Nick said to the survivors once most had been gathered around him. "This isn't gonna work. We're trapped here, backed into a corner, and we're not prepared to fight something like this. So we gotta go." "Where?" someone asked. "Through the woods, to the nearest community. We load the wagons, hitch the animals up, and just go," Nick said. "I know it's a risk, but we're dead if we stay here. Arnold's community doesn't have trees right up against its walls, so if whatever's out there attacks us there, then they gotta come to us. We move out at first light.